Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel for another Project Zomboid video. Now, a lot of you watching this video probably already love Project Zomboid, but today I want to talk about where the game has room to improve in my eyes. I'll be avoiding most of the stuff that the developers have already confirmed and focusing on things that I think the game could use, which hasn't been mentioned, at least that I know of. If you do share some of my opinions in this video, consider dropping it a like and subscribing to the channel. It's a huge help to me and ultimately keeps me doing this. About 88% of those that watch my content aren't subscribed, so if you're a regular viewer, consider joining that 12%. Right, so let's get into my first talking point: base defense options and reasons to use them. So right now in Project Zomboid, we're offered wooden barricades, metal barricades of varying types, barbed wire fences, and sandbags. Now, whilst these options definitely aren't bad, I honestly don't see them used a lot outside of the basic wooden planks for barricades, and the reason behind that is because we aren't really pushed to defend our bases in any way from the zombie threat. The worst it really gets is the helicopter event, which by default is a one-time event, and it's easier to just avoid it entirely if you can. So there are mods out there like Horde Night that challenge you to defend your base from waves of undead every so often, with the number of zombies steadily increasing as time goes on. And whilst this is great fun and is one that we like to run on our whitelisted Patreon server, it's pretty linear. Personally, I'd love to see a selection of meta events that cause zombies to shift location a bit more drastically, and in some cases can be drawn to the player. Things like the current screams or gunshots could be located much closer to the player's location, causing zombies to congregate on a set location rather than shifting them in a particular direction as they do now. You could even relate these events to items you've collected in your base. For example, we all know that generators can break down, but what if the generator doing so now makes a loud bang followed by shuddering to a halt, which draws zombies in the area? It also wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibility to have a small portion of zombies in the same cell as you slowly congregate towards the player's current safe house location if they are inside that safe house for a lengthy amount of time. Now, this doesn't have to be anything huge, it's just enough to make defenses worthwhile building. Now, once we've got those triggers in place, there's a whole lot more in the way of base defense that I think Zomboid could deploy. Things you'd need the right skills to make, and probably later game defenses at that, but things like spike pits crafted by digging out a patch of ground and sticking some sharpened sticks in the bottom of it, or tin can alarm traps maybe for early detection, spikes rigged to walls made from metal piping to get zombies tangled up on your walls or doorways when they're approaching. And not only do I think there's a lot of potential here without going too crazy, it would help develop some occupations and skills too. I'd be interested to hear what kind of thing you guys would like to see in terms of base defense and how it can work, so let me know in the comments. Okay, so I spent a little longer talking about that than I'd originally planned, so let's get into a nice quick one next. Storytelling and narrative improvements. So right now we can tune into radio channels at the start of the apocalypse or watch the news to find out some lore tidbits relating to the outbreak in Knox County. But with NPCs fast approaching, I think now is a really good time for the addition of further narrative and storytelling, both relating to the main story and individual survivors recounting of their own stories. Having a bank of different notes, journal entries, messages for other survivors, that sort of thing, would seriously increase that level of immersion that we get from playing Project Zomboid, and I imagine it could be very easily tied into the upcoming NPCs. It's not a major thing that's absolutely needed by any means, but it definitely could give the game more life. My next suggestion for Project Zomboid is focus on skills and occupations. Now, a lot of these are going to be getting overhauls as part of the new crafting system plans that are due to start with build 42, but there's one skill in particular that I want to focus on here, and that's the medical system that's currently used in Project Zomboid. Personally, I think this is one of the least used skills in the game, and very rarely do players take any occupations that boost medical skills. And after all, why would you? A scratch or laceration is easily solved with a bandage and some good hygiene practice, whereas, well, we all know what happens with a bite, and that's really it in terms of wounds we're likely to get in the PvE version of the game once you know what you're doing. The only real use for the medical system right now is to clean up your mistakes, like getting glass lodged in you or being shot on a PvP server. So the use is limited right now at best, but how could it become more useful than it is currently? Well, I have a few ideas for this, and bear with me on this one. Your initial reaction might be negative, but it might make sense as I go into more detail. My proposal is minor ailments and wounds that can be solved with the use of select medical items, herbal remedies, or, on rare occasion, everyday loot items. These minor ailments would provide XP benefits when treated in the right manner, and would directly relate to a trigger of some kind that could cause this to happen to the player. Now, I'm not suggesting something like a random chance of getting a cold. That would be really frustrating for the average player because there's no reasonable trigger event behind it. The example I'd like to use here is mosquito bites. There are over 200 types of mosquito in the US, with only 12 types carrying potentially harmful germs to humans. Usually it's just an annoying bite and irritation that follows, right? But how does this tie into Project Zomboid? Well, mosquitoes like water, stagnant water, like ponds to be exact. It's where they lay their larvae for hatching. When are we likely to go near water in Project Zomboid? To fish. So fishing is our trigger event, and if a player goes fishing at a particular time of year around dawn or dusk, we can say that the player has a higher chance of catching more fish, but also a chance of getting mosquito bite or two. It wouldn't do anything crazy to your character, maybe a slight increase in unhappiness or an uncomfortable moodle that makes you wake up during the night, maybe make some minor actions slower to complete, but it could be easily solved by things like herbal remedies or ointment to soothe the inflammation, and voila, you've got your medical experience. Now, this is just one example, but this is something we've talked about quite a bit over on my Twitch stream with my regulars, and honestly, there's a whole raft of things you could implement here that are minor enough to not frustrate the average player because they're preventable or avoidable events, but also aren't that big of a deal and provide wannabe doctors with a chance to hone their craft. Leeches from walking around in swamp or marshy areas with uncovered skin, sunburn during particularly hot and sunny weather during the summer months that could be resolved or prevented with various clothing items, something to ponder on at the very least, and at best it will bring much more value to the doctor and nurse occupations. I also think it's important for these minor tasks to have diminishing returns on XP gain as we hit higher levels to prevent them from being farmed for XP points. So next up is a bit of a funny one, because it appears on face value as such a small feature implementation, but actually isn't when it comes to the development work behind it. Now anyway, this next one is sitting and laying down animations and some effect on mechanics as a result. Now this is a feature that a lot of people want in the Project Zomboid community, mostly just because it'd be a nice little implementation for aesthetics, right? It makes sense, it looks nice, and it feels a bit off sitting down in front of a sofa rather than on the sofa when watching TV. The amount of work that goes into making this possible, however, is a bit disproportionate to the benefit it provides to players. Essentially, you're doing all of the animations for multiple actions to be done while sitting down or laying down, and really we can do without it. It's not essential. So my thought here is, how can we make sitting and laying down more beneficial than just being an aesthetic feature? One of the biggest problems that I've seen, at least in multiplayer, is reading and how long it takes to do so. In single player, this isn't so much an issue because we can just skip time, but in multiplayer, this often isn't possible. We can lower reading times, sure, but even then, as you start to reach the higher level books, reading time becomes longer. What if, when sitting down, we get a reasonable percentage increase to reading speed? Perhaps it amplifies anything that reduces stress or anxiety to be more beneficial too, say like reading a comic. My point here is that this could be a good reason to implement the feature that everyone's been after for a little while, but also give it a practical use. Oh, and for anyone that wants this sooner, there's a small collection of mods called True Actions that adds things like sitting, laying down, and dancing. The next one I'm going to touch on is something a lot of you guys may not notice unless you run your own multiplayer servers, but the effects can be very noticeable indeed, and that's server protection options. If you've ever logged into a Project Zomboid server and the spawn area has been picked apart, empty and barren, you've seen the effects of a lack of server protection options. Something I'd really like to see specifically is the protection of loot containers from disassembly. One of the issues that Zomboid experiences is players having spent months and months playing solo, coming into a multiplayer server and doing what many people did in single player to level their carpentry, which is disassembling containers. In single player, it's harmless, but in multiplayer, it can be the difference between a busy server and a dead one. As a server owner myself, I can't express how much trouble this gives us. Aside from that, I'd really like to see the introduction of PvP zones. Currently, we can add PvE safe zones, so the ability to add PvP zones as well would be fantastic. The general consensus among Zomboid players tends to be that PvE is the main part of the game, but some people really do want PvP mixed in. Having it related to high loot areas like military bases seems like a really good solution to me to appease both parties, and would be something I'd like to do myself if the facility is there. The last point I wanted to sort of talk about in this video is something that I'm not sure whether or not the devs have plans for already, so this might already be stuff they're working on, but anyway, I feel like it's a big point for improvement. So as many of you might already know, the developers are shooting for a much longer progression and replayability arc with Project Zomboid. They've already told us that a skills and crafting overhaul is in the works, with more options targeted at long-term play, so that we can eventually get to the stage of producing alternatives for items that can, right now at least, only be found in the world as a loot item. Settlements will form over long periods, and those with high crafting knowledge will be very valuable players. My suggestion here directly ties into this, and that's alternatives to gasoline power. I'd actually like to see the amount of gas on the map reduced to the point where it starts to run dry after about 6 months of in-game time, but with several alternatives available. Salt bins for food preservation if you've got certain levels in cooking and carpentry, for example. Small domestic wind turbines for power generation, or on a larger scale, perhaps the crafting of large water mills, if all the right supplies and skills are available to you. With animals coming in especially, this presents opportunities for things like horse riding, which would provide an alternatives to cars in the late game, and for me, a crafting overhaul is fantastic news, but there's a whole lot more room available for long-term expansion to the current progression in Project Zomboid. So that's it from me in this one. Hopefully you guys agree with some of the points I've raised, and if you don't, let me know why in the comments. I'm all up for positive discussion about possible features for the game. Once again, drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you found it interesting. It greatly helps the channel, and special thanks to all of my patrons for their ongoing support and for playing on our whitelisted Zomboid server. Thanks guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.